Hi, welcome back to the main stage. We've been having an amazing conversation just now, and I am so pleased to welcome Sam from Accenture to the main stage, who was going to talk you through some fascinating conversation starters around the application process. So, Sam, over to you.
Thank you very much, Chris, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm very conscious that I have the 4 o'clock shift. The post-lunch towards the end of the day, you probably just want to go home at this point shift. So I'm going to try and keep this as interactive as possible. I'm on coffee number 3. I hope you're also as pumped as I am. Not a single slide in sight for the next 20, 30 minutes. I'm not going to present any slides. We're just going to have a conversation. And please drop your comments and thoughts and questions in the stage chat and Q&A as we go through, and I will try and answer things as we go through and keep this as interactive as possible, despite the fact we're on stage. So thank you so much for joining me. My name is Sam Turnpenny. I work at a company called Accenture. I have managed our graduate recruitment pipelines for our strategy and consulting grad programs, both at Accenture and at other firms as well. And I now sit in our consulting business, and I help some of the UK's biggest companies innovate their recruitment processes, which is a tough ask, but a lot of firms that you would be familiar with. And today, what I want to do is start to level the playing field. One of my big passions in life is helping young people, especially underrepresented young people, achieve career success. And from all of the client work that I've done, I've learned a few really important things about graduate recruitment that nobody talks about. The fact of the matter is 2021, CVs are dead, cover letters are boring, nobody reads them anyway, take it from a recruiter. And if you want to get a job in 2021, especially as a graduate or an intern, you need to know what's going on behind the scenes. So over the course of the next 20 minutes, I'm going to take you through how some of that actually works. What happens when you submit a job application? How do you really get screened? Chances are you probably don't really know. So hopefully I'm going to teach you something in the next half hour. I want it to be interactive. So tell me if these things are new to you. Tell me if you've already heard them. Put it in the chat. And let's talk about graduate recruitment from the inside out. Before I tell you what I've learned, and I'm going to tell you I've learned 3 things from all of my experience across different industries, different clients that I've worked with, and different recruiting pipelines that I've managed. Before I tell you what those 3 things are, I just want to set the scene, and this is a really important context set. There are 2 different types of recruiting. We call it kind of regular hiring and volume hiring. Now, regular hiring is your recruitment process where you've got a specific role to fill. So as a recruiter, a manager comes to me and says, I need a software developer. I then go and find them a software developer and place them in the job. That's regular. It's a regular recruitment process. What we're talking about today is something called volume hiring. Volume hiring is just when you're hiring the same profile multiple times at the same time. And this could be maybe you need 2 graduates on a graduate program, or it could be the largest I've seen is Teach First, taking almost 2,000 teachers every year. The same job profile, but they take lots of people for the job. And it's a really important distinction to know when we're talking about recruiting and if you're applying for graduate jobs, because volume hiring works very different from your regular recruitment process that you've probably learned about in school and university. Volume hiring is never really about selecting the best candidate for the job. Think about it. If I have to recruit 200 graduates for a consulting graduate program, I could, in theory, select the best 200 graduates for the program. Or, if I was sensible, I would choose 200 people with complementary sets of skills so that I have a really solid group of individuals coming into the business who can help in a range of different areas and complement each other. So when we talk about volume hiring, we're often talking about hiring people with different skills, but that come together to form a really solid unit. That's the context. Volume hiring is graduate jobs, it's internships. It's some of the biggest firms that you might be applying for during the milk round, which is probably ongoing at the moment for most of you. You might be applying for jobs right now if you're in your final year, or internships if you're in your penultimate year. And across all the years of experience that I have in this area, I've learned 3 things that I want to teach you today. The first thing about graduate recruitment that nobody really talks about in any depth is that in every application process that I've seen in the volume hiring space, the first decision is made or at least assisted by some form of artificial intelligence. And you might think, yeah, Sam, I know this. I know everyone knows that. But nobody really knows how artificial intelligence works. a lot of people give this misconception that if they include a certain word on their CV or they don't include a particular qualification, then it's like a yes/no sift, and they'll either be put into a bucket or chucked out the other end. I watched a video the other day of the Google Assistant making a voice call to a Chinese restaurant and ordering a takeaway on its own. Like, if you think AI can do that, obviously AI can do a lot more than just saying yes, no to candidates. AI is smart. Recruiting AI has come a long way in the last 3 to 5 years. It can determine how long it takes you to get a new job when you've been in between jobs, which could be an indicator of how well you interview or your motivation to be in work. There are so many subtleties that AI can pull out. And I think there's a real misconception that you need to include certain things or don't include certain things. In reality, people need to stop trying to outsmart the AI. The AI is getting better and better all the time. And in reality, the way it works is it's just an algorithm of some description, right? And as a recruiter, what I will do is work with my hiring managers to identify what other skills they need within their organization, within their department, within their team, and build a job description. And I will take that job description. There will be a series of skills that are part of that, and I will use those to program into the algorithm. Now, I've programmed these algorithms myself at Accenture and at other organizations. I've helped some of the UK's biggest banks program these algorithms for their clients. They're all based on job specs and company values. We take the company values, we take the skills from the job spec, and we put them into this system. And that will give us an idea of who we might like to hire. The algorithm works in all kinds of different ways. Nobody's making these algorithms for themselves, by the way. Everyone's buying them off the shelf. So if you do enough digging, and you can find lots of information about the software online, the people that sell these algorithms to organizations, to the world's biggest companies. But the way they work is they go through and they look at all the candidates that have applied for the role, and they work out how the skills and strengths and values can match up. Now, every system is different, right? I can't sit here and talk to you about how every system works in detail. That's not going to happen. In reality, what I can tell you is that if you want to make a good application, you need to be really savvy about the way you read job descriptions going forwards, right? And people say this a lot, but if you're writing a CV, we tend to write them from a past experience. We tend to look at what we've done and write out the things we've done in chronological order and work out the skills that we've learned in all of those experiences. In reality, the best way to do it is go the other way. Look at the job description, look at the company values, work out which of those skills that you have, and then work out how you build them into your profile or into your CV. That forward-looking approach to recruiting is how you show the algorithm that you have the skills necessary for the job. And don't get me wrong, you can't just make them up. You can't say, I've done this, I've done that when you haven't. You'll get caught out in the process in some way, shape, or form when you get into interview stage, for example. But make sure you're aligning what you're doing to that job description. Otherwise, there's no chance of getting through that first stage. The most fascinating thing to me was running our strategy graduate recruiting at Accenture and the number of applications that come through where they haven't even mentioned the word strategy once on the application. Like, I find that so bizarre. So use some common sense. Like, look at the job description and work out what skills you need to include. So essentially, you've gone through this process and you're thinking, Sam, this is not necessarily new information for me. The algorithm selects candidates that have the right skills. What happens next? Well, the way all AI software works in recruiting is it ranks the candidates. It can do it in all kinds of different ways. It can score the candidates. It can give you a list. It can group them into different areas. Different platforms work in different ways. But essentially, it ranks the candidates based on who is most likely to have the skills that you're looking for and who is least likely to have the skills that you're not looking for. Now, what happens then is up to the firm, right? So at Accenture, I'm very, very cognizant of the fact that if you train the AI using models of the past, which might already be biased because of the way recruiting processes used to work in the past and the kind of candidates we might have hired going in the past. I'm of the mentality that I will look at my sets and I will test them and I will say, right, let's look at the candidates that the AI is suggesting is good candidates. Let's look at the applications where the AI is suggesting they're not good candidates, and I'll test it and I'll make sure that I agree as a human being and as a recruiter with the decisions that are being made. And then I will use that to select the candidates that I want to select. This is really important. And if you're listening to this conversation, you're thinking, oh my gosh, that's crazy. Accenture and other organizations are making decisions based on the output of an algorithm. Then unfortunately, that's the way it is. The reason being is that these kind of big firms are receiving 20, 30, 40, up to 50,000 applications per year. If you do the math on that and you try and work out how many minutes it takes a recruiter to look at a CV and how many recruiters you need, you probably need a team of about 5 or 10 people for about 12 months to review anywhere in the region of 20 to 30,000 CVs. So it's not possible. It can't be done. You have to use the AI in some way, shape, or form. What's important is that as a recruiter, we then test that and we make sure that the algorithm is not perpetuating existing biases. And what we then do is identify the candidates that we want to select. Now, at Accenture, I go through all of my applications and I review the candidates that are in the bucket for being pushed forwards. And then I select the ones that I think have the best skills and the best potential, and we can put forward to online assessment. At other organizations, it doesn't work like that. So there are plenty of other firms where they'll test the AI to make sure that it's not biased, and then they will just send off all the top applications to online assessment and see how they perform in the online assessment process. So there are different ways of managing that. But essentially, there's some kind of ranking that goes on behind the scenes. So how can you, knowing all this information, what can you do to get to that online assessment stage? What can you do to push yourself forwards? Well, we've already spoken about how we need to look at the job description and the company values in order to craft our CVs and our profiles. But the other thing that I think is really important is to make sure that you include as much information in your profiles as possible as you're building them out. It is really silly to think that if you can put in the bare basics of experience and you'll get a job. It's also really ridiculous to think that you should select only the information that you think is relevant to the job. You've not been a recruiter in the space. You've probably not worked in the space. You're probably applying for a new area. You don't know what the skills are. You can have an idea from the job spec, but you don't know exactly what the skills are that are being looked for. And also, you don't know what the recruiter is looking for. At Accenture, we're hiring on potential, not on past experience. So if you only put down consulting experiences on your CV, that doesn't show me that you're a well-rounded candidate. It doesn't show me all the things that you're doing extracurricular. It doesn't show me some of the really cool schoolwork that you're really happy that you've done and achieved. All of those things make you who you are. And when we're in a volume process and we're assessing for potential in the future, it's really important to see that broad balanced picture. So you want to put as much information as you can into that initial application in order to give yourself the best chance of the algorithm selecting the skills and identifying the skills that we're looking for within the application process. I'll wrap that section up. AI, really important to know how it works. Nobody knows how it works. And in reality, even the recruiters don't know exactly the algorithms that go on. They're proprietary information. They're held by companies that sell these solutions to organizations. But you can find out loads of information online. Go and do some digging. Go and find out who's making these solutions. And you can find a lot online about how that works. There's a lot of academic research as well around recruiting processes, especially when we talk about D&I and bias. So go online and do your research and find out if you're interested in this space. So that's AI. That's my lesson number one. AI is in every single process, and every single first decision involves AI in some way, shape, or form. If you have any questions on that or anything you think I went through too quickly, then please drop it in the chat or in the Q&A. The second thing that I've learned over the course of my experience is that assessments generally are becoming more and more standardized. And in a volume hiring process, this is really important. It would be impossible to suggest that a human being could look at hundreds and hundreds of applications and do hundreds of interviews and be able to instinctively tell who is the best candidate. Doesn't matter how much experience I have as a recruiter, how many candidates that I've interviewed over the course of my career. Clearly, the answer is hundreds, probably 1,000. I don't know, but definitely in the upper end of the hundreds. We always need some way of standardizing that process. To give you a bit of an example, some of the big firms, some of the big four and organizations like Accenture might be interviewing in the region of 2,000 candidates a year for all of their apprenticeships, internships, and graduate programs. And leadership within those organizations need to be really clear that the hiring decisions that are being made are based on some form of scientific assessment. So assessments are standardized. There is always a standard framework by which we are working to as recruiters when we're interviewing candidates or when we're designing the assessments, like online assessments, that will assess the candidates. You're never going to know exactly what that framework is. No recruiter is going to tell you the secret behind their own recruiting process. However, you can find out a lot of information online. You can find out a lot of information around what kind of people the organization hires, what kind of skills they hire for, and what they assess for at interview. One of your best friends in this process is Glassdoor. There are so many people that have done the assessment centers for all the big organizations. Go and see what they talk about. Go and see the kind of interviews that they had. Go and see the questions that they were asked. People post that kind of stuff on the internet nowadays. Go and find out and do a bit of digging and work out what the skills might be. We're always assessing against a framework when we're talking about a volume process, except maybe towards the very end stages when we might go more into specialist technical interviews with hiring managers or subject matter experts. But by and large, through that process, there's a standardization. So how can you use this to your advantage is the question. I think one of the really important things to remember when you're going through a volume hiring process is to remember that if there's a standard framework that's being assessed, everything that you're doing is there for a reason. It's not a standard interview. If you're in an assessment center, it's not a standard interview with a recruiter or with a hiring manager where we're talking about your experience and we're probing. A lot of the time, they are specific questions that are designed to find out if you have specific skills or specific strengths that the organization is looking to hire for. So it's really, really critically important that you listen to the question and that you understand the question that's being asked to you. One of the biggest mistakes that people make, and I've interviewed plenty of candidates in my time, is trying to guess too quickly what is being asked of them. When you hear the question, you need to take a moment and think about what kind of skills might they be looking for? What is the question really asking here? It's very easy to just jump in and think, I'm in an interview, it's a high pressure scenario, I need to look confident, let's just quickly say something. Which is great, and it's good that you're confident, but the best interviews that I've done are where the candidates take a moment, pause, think about the question, and plan in their head how they're going to answer it to make sure that they specifically answer the question that's being asked. It might seem like a really basic point, but when you're in the heat of the moment, it's really difficult to align on that. And remember that we're always assessing against a framework, so you're always being scored in some way, shape, or form against the skills that the organization is looking for. So make sure that you're taking the time to think about the question, because if you don't, how on earth are you going to demonstrate that you have the skills and strengths that the organization wants to hire for? The last thing I want to talk about in the standardization process, which is really, really, really important, is you must find out who you're talking to. Again, a common misconception is that all interviews are the same, all interviewers are the same. Actually, in reality, you can be interviewed by a wide range of people. An interview with a recruiter for a job in software engineering is likely to be very different to an interview with a senior software developer within software engineering. If you're interviewing with a recruiter, it's highly likely that they're going to ask questions around the framework, and it's highly unlikely that they're going to have an in-depth knowledge of software engineering. I've hired for technical roles and data roles, and I'm not a huge technical expert. So I'm not going to start drilling into the detail on how you build applications, right? And if you knew that coming into the interview, you asked who your interviewer was going to be, or you asked at the beginning of the interview what my role is, then you would know that I'm a recruiter, and therefore it's important that you pitch your skills against the skills that the organization is looking for. However, if you go into an interview with a hiring manager, it's a completely different story. If you're going into an interview with someone who actually works in the industry and understands the detail, then it's really important that you go into that detail and you show them you know what you're talking about. A hiring manager is less likely to be looking for teamwork skills, communication skills, and more likely to be wanting to know, do you know how to code in R? Do you know how to build an algorithm in Azure machine learning? And they want to test those key skills. And if you don't know the answer and you can't find out in advance of the assessment center, ask the question. When you go into the interview, say to the interviewer, can you tell me what your role in the organization? If you're feeling confident, say, can you tell me what you're looking for in today's interview? They might say no, but there's no harm in asking. And a lot of recruiters and hiring managers will say, I'm assessing against a framework, or I'm looking to test your technical skills, and you can benchmark yourself then, and you know that you're pushing yourself in the right direction. So 3 main things to take out of this. Firstly, assessments are standardized. See what you can find out online about the skills framework they're assessing against. Secondly, it's really important to answer the question that's being asked to you. Otherwise, you will completely miss the mark. And thirdly, find out who you're talking to and find out what they're looking for. It's going to be hugely different depending on the type of person you're talking to. So those are the first 2 things I've learned. AI is in every process and is normally involved in decision making. And secondly, assessments and selection processes are standardized. The third thing that I've learned, and this is particularly relevant for today's conversation, is that diversity is top of everyone's agendas. And that might not surprise you, but genuinely, I have had conversations in just the last few weeks with some of the UK's biggest banks and a couple of other big organizations that you guys would be very familiar with that I can't name, tech platforms that you use every day, and they are constantly trying to work out how they improve the diversity of their workforce. And in most of those conversations, they're doing it because it's the right thing to do. They're doing it because they want to genuinely make a difference. And it's very easy to be sat here on the other end of a call like this and think, yeah, everyone's talking about it, but who's actually really doing it? A lot of people really genuinely want to do it. The thing is, it's a really tricky space to operate in. And I tell you why. This is a very, very frank conversation. This is very much my opinion. I won't pretend to speak on behalf of Accenture on this one. The landscape for hiring diverse talent is tricky because we have very strict laws in the UK around discrimination, which are there for a reason, and they're very, very important laws. But they work both ways. You can't discriminate against someone. You can't positively discriminate against any other group. So it's really important when you run any hiring process that you run it fairly. So there are therefore questions that you have to ask yourself as an employer as to how do you make sure you're hiring diverse talent when you can't specifically select diverse candidates. That would be completely unethical. I think we're all agreed on that. And the way organizations do it, there are a couple of ways, but the two main ways that they do it is by what we call like proactive sourcing. And secondly, by bridging the gap and working out how we can get more diverse talent through the hiring process. And it's important to be aware of these two things when you're tackling a hiring process because they are super relevant. So the first, when we talk about proactive sourcing, it means employers are going out, like lots of employers are doing today on this call, and trying to identify groups of students, particularly in the volume hiring space, who wouldn't see themselves working at the organization, and they can bridge that gap. They can start to talk about what the organization is like, they can put role models in front of you, and they can encourage you to make an application. By increasing the number of applications from diverse groups within their pool, they have an increased likelihood of hiring more diverse talent. But that's not a be-all and end-all. What's most critically important is bridging the gap on getting those candidates through the process. So what a lot of firms will do, and I've been helping a really big bank recently do exactly this, is looking at the recruiting process in detail and identifying where the problem areas are. And if you actually think about recruiting processes, a lot of them have been designed by people in charge who, generally speaking, in the current state, especially when we talk about financial services, are not always from very diverse groups, very big lack of diversity a lot of the time in leadership teams across certain industries. And so we have to look at the processes and say, have these things been designed in a way where certain groups of students are falling through the process? So we might look at an application process and we'll use the data and we'll say with our clients, okay, well, look, this online assessment, if you look at the stats, a black candidate coming through this process is 4% more likely to drop out at this stage than a white candidate. So there's clearly a problem here, right? There's clearly something about this process and this stage in the process that needs to change. And there are two ways you can fix that. You can either say, right, we have to change the assessment, which is obviously the right thing to do, and we'll work out what is wrong with it and we'll make a change to it. It can be quite tricky to get right, but there are mechanisms by which you can do that. And the second thing is by taking it back out to the students and saying, right, in certain target groups, let's say, for example, students who went to school in areas with a low participation in university. In those particular student groups, there is a particular lack of X skill, let's call it communication, which is making students fall down within the assessment center process. So therefore, what we'll do is we'll create an experience, an insight day, a program for those students to teach them more about that particular skill and upskill a group of students and then follow them through that process and see if that bridges the gap. It's really important to be aware of that and know how that works, because those are things that you should actively leverage, right? As employers are doing the math and running the numbers on this and working out where they need to bridge the gap. So it's really important that you go out there and identify where there are opportunities to bridge that gap. The flip side of it as well, which is also really important, is that it gives you an idea of which employers really care about doing something and actively getting involved in the space compared to those that are just talking about diversity. If you actually look at the organizations, a great example in the LGBT space is Clifford Chance. They have fantastic programs for LGBT students. And I don't know if they're here on the call today, but I love them. They're amazing, great recruitment team. They actively are trying to bridge the gap. They're actively trying to make a difference. And if you can identify firms that are doing that, you know that you're going into a space where you're highly likely to be welcomed and included in conversations. So diversity, critically important, top of everyone's hiring agenda. There is a science to this, and it's really important that you leverage that. It's really important that you understand how that works and how you can use that to your advantage. So we've talked about three things. We've talked about AI, we've talked about assessments, we've talked about diversity. I'm going to bring it to a stop there. Otherwise, I'm going to be talking at you for ages and ages and ages. But I hope that's really helpful information for you. And I hope that's stuff that you didn't necessarily know. And it starts the cogs thinking in your brain around what you might want to do as you approach your internship and grad applications in the future. I'll pause and take questions. And I'm really, really keen to find out what you guys have made of this presentation and what your thoughts are. I absolutely have never delivered this presentation before. And I'm sure my graduate recruitment colleagues at Accenture will be screaming at the screen that I've been sharing secrets that they have not otherwise shared. But that's okay. I'll take that blame. And let's have some questions and let's see how we found that. Chris, sorry.
Well, I just wanted to say something, like, let's call it a sneak peek, right? What a refreshing presentation. You know, just like the honesty. I've never been so engaged by not watching slides before.
I hate slides. It's important to have a conversation about this stuff, right? It's really, really important.
I think this is why I said to everyone that was watching, we were having such a fascinating conversation backstage. I mean, there are loads of questions in the stage Q&A. Now, Great. I don't know if you want me to group them, if you want to go through and have a look at certain questions, but
let's go through and have a look. Yeah, I think let's go through.
Okay. One of the key things I wanted to ask you, though, just because we've come off the back of the last topic of diversity, and we started talking about it, was, you know, this concept of like bias in, bias out. You know, AI, and you read about it with like social media platforms and the algorithms of if you watch certain things, other negative things sort of come up on your feed. What's your sort of take on that, and how do organizations sort of reduce that bias in, bias out? How do they measure it and monitor it?
Yeah, it's a really good point. And if you're not familiar with this process, then I guess just to set the scene, AI algorithms have to be trained in some way. It's exactly like having a real recruiter, right? The idea is they replace a recruiter, and they have to be trained exactly the same way you train a recruiter. So you have to give them some kind of input data. And the problem is, if you look at, let's say, who is perform well in the organization, and then you look at their skills and use that as your benchmark for who will be successful in the future, then you're probably using a very undiverse group of individuals, leaders, managers, current grads, etc., to make that assessment. And if you put the bias in, the bias comes out the other side. It will dish you out a bunch of other applications. The mechanism for changing that is to look at like a level below. So you don't just look at the application, you don't look at the people and say, well, what are the skills that make them successful? You have to go into the next level, which is around strengths. You have to say, what kind of strengths? Because strengths are universal. We all have different strengths. We don't have to learn. So we have to learn skills, right, throughout the course of our education. So what we've been, the experiences we've had, the school we went to, the university we went to, will dictate the skills we have. But strengths are underlying for all of us. We all have strengths, whether we like it or not, right? So if we look below the level of skills and we look at those strengths, we can identify what are the kind of things that therefore make you successful. It's really important, though, at that point, that even once you've done a really detailed strengths analysis, that you check it and you recheck it and you check it again. You have to go through, and the beauty of doing it with AI is that you can pull a lot of data out of the platform, but you have to go through and say, right, if we did a screen right now with our candidates based on this information, what would the diversity of the cohort look like that it recommended? If there are problems with that, if that's not representative of the population, and you can compare it against applications received versus the target group that you've looked to hire, you can then say, right, there's problems with the way we've developed the strengths, and we have to go back and do that. And it's really important that firms do that. And one of the conversations that, Chris, we were having before, which is so fascinating, is that the role of recruiters is changing, right? Instead of sitting here in front of screens looking at CVs all day, we're actually now learning about ethical AI. We're having to train algorithms to perform in a way that's ethical, which is a skill set that didn't exist in recruiting 3 or 5 years ago. So it's a fascinating shift. It's a really, really important discussion to have. And I'm actively helping organizations have those conversations right now.
And then, things to read up on, right? And all you've got to do is put that into a search, and you'll be inundated with the good, bad, and ugly. And there's so many documentaries on Netflix now where facial recognition is being used in certain ways to discriminate in the US. So a topic I think that we could talk about for hours.
Of course.
We'll get our own subject on it. Okay, so can you see the questions on the backstage as well?
I can, yeah. Shall I run through some of them? I think it's really... It's great that you guys have left loads of questions as well. I'm really, really pleased. I'll start from the bottom because I think they were the oldest ones. So Thomas says, is AI something that every recruiter uses? I mean, pretty much. Don't get me wrong, especially when we talk about regular hiring, we're doing one particular role. yes, there are still plenty of organizations that are not utilizing AI, where recruiters are making the judgment, but it's doable if you have 20 applications for a job. In any volume hiring process, if you're hiring anything more than about 20 people for the same role, you have to use some kind of AI, because you're going to have hundreds of applications, and it's very difficult to review every single application. And unless you review every single application, how do you know that you've got the right candidate? So it's really important to have a way of organizing it. The other thing to remember is that this AI is becoming cheaper and more accessible thanks to a lot of suppliers that are providing it. So it's becoming hugely widespread across recruiting and across organizations. So I'd be very surprised to learn about any big graduate recruitment team that with a large number of hires each year that isn't using some form of AI at some way in the process. Next question, does AI make the job application process a bit of a game and more about people who can play the game best rather than finding the right people? Oh, that's a very good question. I suppose to a degree you could argue that it's a bit of a game. There is a set of skills, or there are a certain list of criteria that you need to meet, and there's a way of doing that. Now, yes, there's an element of you have to play the game, and I've kind of spoken about that, right? You have to look at the job description, you have to find the skills, you have to do the bit of the work yourself and get to that point. But I don't think that necessarily is not about finding the right people. The right people will do that research and find out the information and position themselves best for the role, right? In theory. And in most organizations, those are exactly the kind of skills that we're looking for in graduate hires. I don't like the word game. It isn't a game, it's people's lives, it's your careers, it's a really important thing. And that's why it's not a simple, can you find the hidden clue and then you'll get the job? There's still a process there. But it's really important that you understand how that process works. And I think as we start to talk about uncovering some of the secrets and how it actually works behind the scenes, it should get you thinking about the way that you can approach it. And that shouldn't be any different to before you do this information. You should still have been trying to work out what the process was and how to approach it. But now you should go into it with a bit more knowledge about what's actually happening behind the scenes. Another question, does it change over time? Is it something you can control as the recruiter? Absolutely yes and yes. So the skills that you'll hire across the organization will change very quickly. So the algorithm will change constantly, and it is something that every recruiter will control in some way, shape or form. When you're building the role, you'll have to determine in some way in the application what are the kind of skills that you're looking for. And there might be things in there that are like reminiscent of the old way of hiring that we used to be. So for example, if there's a graduate program and the requirement is must have a degree with a 2-1, then those kind of things will be baked into the algorithm and they will be a simple yes/no answer, right? But more importantly, the recruiter will play an active role in shaping the skills and strengths within that in order to get the right candidates out. What else? Other questions. How much is based on skills, strengths versus culture fit? That's a really good question. And I think that it depends massively on the organization. But any good organization should be looking more about skills and strengths than culture fit. Culture fit is a big red flag for me as a recruiter, especially when we talk about D&I, because it insinuates that you're allowing someone to make a decision on whether or not they fit in the organization. And that is just prone to bias. If you have some kind of standardized framework to assess your candidates against, so when you talk about skills and strengths, then you have a way of making sure that you're assessing fairly and you're looking for a really specific set of skills, strengths, experience, whatever it might be. So I think the trend, especially in volume hiring, is going more towards strengths and skills than it is around culture fit. Doesn't to say that culture fit doesn't exist. It definitely does. There are plenty of firms that have like fit interviews. But I sincerely hope in the next 5 to 10 years, most of those will be gone because they're not relevant and they just perpetuate lack of diversity in organizations. And then my favorite question at the top here is, what's the best way of saying I don't know in an interview? The answer is I don't know. Don't try and sugarcoat it. As a recruiter, we're looking for you to be confident in what you do know and don't know. And there are definitely interviews and interview styles where recruiters will ask you something they don't expect you to know to see how you respond. And if you try and I was going to use a bad word then. If you try and make up a response and try and paddle through the answer, that will be really obvious to the recruiter, and it will insinuate that you are not confident enough to admit when you don't know the answer. And ultimately, we want you to learn. If we're hiring you for a grad role, We don't really want you to come in being a know-it-all. We want you to be ready to learn about the organization, about what you want to be doing. So the best way of saying I don't know is I don't know. Don't be afraid to ask the recruiter to repeat the question. Don't be afraid to ask for more information. Don't be afraid to say, if that's something you want a specific answer on, I can take it offline and come back to you. Like, just be confident in what you do know, and be frank with the recruiter. Don't try and play a game. It will never work in your favor. Having interviewed hundreds of candidates, you can tell when someone's lying, like just straight off the bat. Shall I stop there? I don't know what time I'm supposed to be talking to, so there are more questions, but
well, the thing is, Sam, like, we'll change the agenda. We'll just have you for the rest of the afternoon.
Okay, fine, done.
I was going to ask a question actually around.
Go for it.
I really like actually installing confidence in people to be able to say, "Can I ask what you're looking for from this question or interview?" Because I think sometimes it can be such a power shift and power dynamic, and you feel like I'm coming to this interview to impress. Well, ultimately, it's both ways, right? But when you were speaking, it sort of got me thinking, when you go for an interview, it's kind of drummed into you about the STAR mentality, situation, task, action. Do you think that is outdated now, or do you think that we should be looking at something a bit different?
I love this question. The STAR method is helpful in structuring an answer. However, it can limit you in what you say during the response. The best interviews, in my opinion, are conversational. And you have to remember that when you put yourself in front of someone, it's just two humans having a conversation, maybe more than two, but it's just people having a conversation. And when you start to go into this level of, I must do an S, a T, an A, an R, it becomes very robotic. Someone asks a question, you go through a set response, they go to the next question, and it feels awkward. And if you are in a culture fit interview, there's no way you're going to get in if you're doing that kind of an awkward interview, right? You need to show your personality. We're also hiring you for being you, right? I don't want to say that STAR is outdated, because I think it is a really helpful tool to use to make sure you've covered things, but use it in the right way. A lot of time we're seeing now in the graduate recruitment processes that recruiters are asking less around, give me an example of a time when you did X, Y, Z. There's a distinct bias in those kind of questions, those experience questions, because people that have had opportunity to access internships through their networks, et cetera, do unpaid internships, are going to have more to talk about. So most forward-thinking firms are now trying to pivot towards a future-looking approach. How might you approach this scenario? What would you do in this situation? And then the STAR approach is completely irrelevant, right? You can't do that mechanism in a future. What you need to do is take a moment, think, work out what the question is really asking, and start to analyze what kind of responses. And you have to do it quite quickly, but you can take your time. And I like I say, the best interviews that I've done are when the candidate just takes a moment, thinks about the response, plans it in their head, and then says, right, here's what I'm going to tell you, and goes through it in a methodical way. It doesn't have to be STAR. The other thing that is really worth mentioning on your point, Chris, is the other thing that I really want people to take away is that you should have the confidence not just to ask about what the recruiter's looking for, but also to make demands of the organization. If it is a fit interview, but even if it's a strengths interview, it's really important that you're trying to find the firm that will suit you, not just that the firm's looking for a candidate. So if, for example, it's really important to you that you work at a firm with high sustainability targets, right? And you want to work at a sustainable firm, then ask them about their net zero emission goals, right? Ask them those kind of questions. If you're in the LGBT plus community, like myself, and you want to know what they're doing to support their LGBT colleagues, ask that question. A good recruiter, a good hiring manager in an organization that looks after their LGBT plus colleagues should have an answer to that question, and you shouldn't have to sugarcoat it. What are you doing to support your LGBT plus colleagues in the workplace? They should be able to give you 2 or 3 solid things that they are doing. And if they can't, that is kind of a red flag to me. It might be that they were put on the spot or they weren't expecting it and we can cut them some slack. But in reality, if they're running an interview, they should know the answer to that question. And that doesn't just apply to LGBT, but that applies to everything, right? What are you doing to support your Black colleagues in the workplace? What are you doing to support women in the workplace? Whatever is important to you in your workplace culture, ask that question. And it is really good as a recruiter to see candidates that are thinking about that fit, because it shows the interviewer that this candidate is not just up for grabs if I want them, but they have to also choose our firm. They have to also choose me. And you should assert that authority when you're interviewing.
Yeah. Well, fantastic, wise words. Thank you, Sam. So, I think the questions we've covered, we hope then that there will be some research or something out that we can tap in, all dependent if your colleagues let you out again.
Probably not after this.
It's a huge thank you from us for sharing those insights. Extremely refreshing and definitely well needed as we see the future of attraction and the future of recruitment. So thank you so much, Sam. For everyone watching, the next presentation will be on the main stage with me at 10 to 5. Thank you all so much.
Fantastic. Thank you.